You think you're in control, but what if the voice in your head isn't the one making the decisions? You choose, you act, you explain yourself. But something feels slightly off, like your reactions arrive before your reasons, like your desires don't always ask permission. You call it me, but sometimes it behaves like a stranger. And the unsettling part? It knows you better than you know it. Freud believed the real question isn't what you think, but what thinks through you. It often begins in the smallest moments, the ones too ordinary to suspect. A misplaced word in conversation, a sudden irritation that feels disproportionate, a decision made quickly, then justified slowly. You move through your day with a quiet confidence that your thoughts belong to you, that your choices emerge from a place you can access and understand. But something doesn't add up. There are gaps, subtle, almost invisible, between intention and action, between explanation and origin. Freud's unsettling proposal was not that we are irrational, but that we are not fully present to ourselves. Beneath the surface of conscious awareness, he suggested, there exists a deeper layer of mental life, active, structured, and profoundly influential. The unconscious is not a void. It is a presence. It shapes without announcing itself, directs without asking permission. At the same time, this idea resists our instincts. We are taught to trust introspection, to believe that if we look inward carefully enough, we will find clarity. But Freud disrupts this confidence. He implies that looking inward is not like opening a window. It is more like entering a dimly lit room where shapes shift and meanings distort. What you see may already be altered by the very forces you are trying to observe. This is where things become difficult. If the unconscious shapes thought, then even the act of questioning oneself may be guided by something hidden. A person might believe they are choosing freely while unknowingly following patterns formed long ago, patterns rooted in forgotten experiences, suppressed emotions, unresolved conflicts. The self, in this sense, is not a single voice, but a layered conversation, much of it happening out of earshot. Freud did not simply introduce a concept, he altered the terrain of self-understanding. In works like The Interpretation of Dreams, he treated dreams not as random images, but as coded messages, expressions of desires and fears that could not appear directly in waking life. Even slips of the tongue, those fleeting mistakes we laugh off, were seen as meaningful disruptions, small cracks where the hidden mind briefly surfaces. Yet this raises another question. If so much of what we are lies beyond awareness, what does it mean to know oneself? The pursuit becomes less about certainty and more about interpretation. You begin to listen differently to your hesitations, your contradictions, your recurring thoughts. You notice patterns, but they don't fully explain themselves. They hint. And perhaps this is the quiet shift Freud leaves us with. The self is no longer something given, something immediately available. It becomes something to uncover, to approach carefully, knowing that each discovery might reveal not clarity, but further depth. You continue to think, to act, to decide, but somewhere beneath it all, something else is moving, something patient, something persistent. And the more you try to grasp it, the more it seems to ask, silently and endlessly, who exactly is doing the searching? You think you chose this. The words you speak, the things you want, the life you're building, it all feels like you. But what if it isn't? What if your decisions are just the final scene of a story you never saw being written. You call it logic, intention, control. But beneath that surface, something older is pulling the strings. Desires you didn't approve, fears you didn't invite. And they don't ask for permission. So when you say, I chose this, who exactly is the I? It often begins in the smallest, most ordinary moments. You reach for a certain book, choose one path over another, fall in love with a person you cannot fully explain. Nothing feels forced. On the contrary, it feels natural, almost obvious. You experience yourself as the author of these actions, quietly confident that your life unfolds through your own will. But something doesn't add up. Why this book and not another? Why this person and not someone equally kind? Why does a trivial comment linger in your mind for days, while something objectively more important disappears without trace? The surface explanation, preference, reasoning, personality, seems too thin, too convenient. It explains everything and nothing at once. This is where Sigmund Freud enters the scene, not as a comfort, but as a disturbance. His idea is disarmingly simple. What you call choice may not originate where you think it does. The conscious mind, the part that speaks and decides, is only a fragment. Beneath it lies a deeper, more obscure territory, the unconscious, where impulses form long before they are noticed. At the same time, these impulses are not random. They are structured, shaped by childhood experiences, repressed desires, unresolved tensions. They carry a history. And yet, when they surface, they do so disguised. A preference feels like a reason. A reaction feels justified. A decision appears deliberate. You do not see the origin. You only see the outcome. This is where things become difficult. Because if Freud is right, then control is not something you simply have. It is something you construct after the fact. The mind tells itself a story. I chose this because, but the because often comes later, like a narrator trying to make sense of a plot already unfolding. And still, the feeling of control remains incredibly convincing. It has to. Without it, the sense of self would begin to fracture. To live without believing in your own agency would be unbearable. So the mind protects this illusion, not out of deception, but out of necessity. Yet, this raises another question. If your choices are influenced by forces you cannot fully access, are you still responsible for them? Or does responsibility itself become another kind of story, one that holds together a fragile sense of order? Freud does not offer a simple answer. Instead, he deepens the tension. He suggests that freedom is not the absence of influence, but the gradual awareness of it. Not full control, but a shifting boundary between what is known and what remains hidden. And even then, the boundary never disappears. You begin to notice patterns. Certain reactions repeat. Certain desires return in different forms. You become aware, perhaps, that something inside you moves before you do. But awareness is not the same as mastery. Seeing the mechanism does not necessarily stop it. So you live in a paradox. You act and you reflect. You choose and you question the choice. You feel in control. And at the same time, you suspect that control is incomplete. And maybe that is the point. Because the question is no longer just whether you are in control. It is whether the idea of control was ever as solid as it seemed. And once that doubt appears, it does not leave easily. It lingers quietly in the background of every decision, waiting. You've felt it, two voices in your head pulling in opposite directions. One wants everything right now, no consequences. Another tells you to stop, to behave, to be better. And somewhere in between, there's a third voice trying to make sense of it all. But here's the uncomfortable part. None of these voices is fully you. One is primitive, one is borrowed, one is exhausted. And your personality, it might just be the uneasy agreement they've settled on. So when you say I, who exactly is speaking? There are moments, often quiet and unremarkable, when the illusion of a unified self begins to crack. You hesitate before speaking. You want something, you immediately judge. You promise restraint, then betray it within hours. It feels inconsistent, almost like a failure of character. But something doesn't add up. The conflict is too persistent, too structured to be random. It begins to feel less like chaos and more like a pattern. This is where Freud's model enters, not as a rigid map, but as a way of naming what already feels familiar. The id, the ego, the superego, not three separate entities, but three forces woven into the same interior space, each with its own logic, each convinced of its own necessity. The id speaks first, though rarely in words. It is urgency without reflection, hunger, desire, impulse. It does not wait, does not negotiate. It wants what it wants, and it wants it now. In many ways, it is the oldest part of you, echoing something ancient and biological. When you feel a sudden craving, a surge of anger, or an irrational longing, you're hearing it. But almost immediately, another voice intervenes. Slower, more deliberate. The ego, it listens to the id, but also to reality. It understands consequences, time, and limitation. It knows that not every desire can be fulfilled without cost. So it calculates, adjusts, delays. It is not moral, not in itself. It is practical. It asks, what is possible? And what will happen next? And yet this is not the end of the conversation, because there is also a third presence, quieter, but often more severe, the superego. It does not ask what is possible. It asks what is right. It carries the weight of expectation, parents, culture, ideals you absorbed before you could question them. It praises, it condemns, it sets standards that are often impossible to meet. When you feel guilt without clear cause or shame that lingers beyond reason, it is there. At first, it might seem that harmony would come from silencing one of these voices. But this is where things become difficult. Remove the id, and life loses its energy, its drive. Remove the superego, and direction dissolves into impulse. Remove the ego, and there is no bridge between desire and reality. Each force, in its own way, is necessary, and yet none of them is sufficient. So the mind becomes a place of negotiation, not peaceful, not stable, but active. The ego stands in the middle, translating demands into actions, compromises into identity. It tries to satisfy the ID without provoking the superego, to follow the superego without denying the id entirely. It rarely succeeds completely. That is why tension persists. But perhaps this tension is not a flaw. Perhaps it is the very condition that allows a self to exist at all. Because if you were only instinct, you would not reflect. If you were only morality, you would not choose. If you were only reason, you would not feel. It is the friction between these forces that creates movement, and in that movement, something like identity begins to take shape. Yet this raises another question. If the I is constantly balancing, adjusting, responding, can it ever be stable? Or is it always provisional, always in the process of becoming? Freud's model does not give a comforting answer. It suggests that what you call yourself is not a single voice, but an ongoing conversation, one that began before you were aware of it and may never fully resolve. And maybe that is why, in certain quiet moments, you still feel divided. Not broken, just composed of parts that have not agreed on a final form. You think your desires belong to you, that you choose them, but then one appears, sudden, irrational, almost judged. You didn't plan it, you didn't ask for it, and yet it stays. You try to push it away, rename it, hide it, but it keeps returning like it knows something you don't. And that's the uncomfortable truth. What if desire isn't something you decide, but something that decides you? What if the part of you that wants never asked for permission? There is a moment, often quiet and almost unnoticeable, when a thought crosses the mind and leaves behind a trace of desire. It may be inappropriate, unexpected, or strangely persistent. At first, it feels like an interruption, something foreign entering the carefully arranged order of the self. But something doesn't add up. If it feels so alien, why does it carry such familiarity? Why does it return again and again as if it belongs? Sigmund Freud would argue that this is precisely the point where our sense of control begins to fracture. Desire, in his view, is not born in the conscious mind, where choices are made and identities are constructed. It emerges from a deeper, less negotiable place, a reservoir of instincts that do not ask whether they are appropriate, moral, or even welcome. They simply are. At the center of this idea lies the concept of drives, particularly those tied to sexuality and aggression. These are not polite inclinations. They do not align themselves neatly with social expectations or personal ideals. Instead, they press forward, seeking expression. And this is where things become difficult, because while these drives insist, the conscious self resists. A tension forms, not between different choices, but between different layers of the same person. You might notice it in small ways, a sudden attraction that disrupts a stable relationship, a flash of anger that feels disproportionate to the situation, or a recurring fantasy that refuses to fade, no matter how firmly it is dismissed. These are not random glitches. They are signals, expressions of something that has not been granted permission, but exists nonetheless. Freud described repression as the mechanism that keeps these desires out of conscious awareness. It is not a simple act of forgetting, but an active, ongoing process. The mind works to push certain impulses down, to bury them beneath layers of rational thought and social conditioning. But repression is never complete. What is pushed away does not disappear. It returns, disguised, distorted, but still carrying its original force. At the same time, this raises another question. If desire operates beyond our control, what does that say about responsibility? If we do not choose what we want, are we accountable for it? Freud's answer is unsettling. He does not absolve us of responsibility, but he shifts its location. We may not choose our desires, but we are still responsible for how we relate to them, whether we acknowledge them, distort them, or deny them entirely. Yet even this is not a stable solution, because acknowledgement does not dissolve desire, it merely changes its form. To recognize a forbidden impulse is not to eliminate it, but to bring it closer, to make it part of the narrative of the self. And this can be even more destabilizing than repression, because now the desire is no longer an external disturbance. It is something internal, something that must be integrated or continually negotiated. There is a quiet irony here. We often think of freedom as the ability to choose, to decide what we want, what we pursue, what we reject. But Freud's theory suggests a more complicated picture. The foundation of our wanting is not freely chosen. It is given, inherited, shaped by forces that precede conscious thought. Freedom, then, may not lie in choosing our desires, but in how we live with the fact that they are not entirely ours to command. And so the tension remains between what we feel and what we allow ourselves to feel, between the impulses that arise and the identities we try to maintain. It is not a conflict that can be resolved once and for all. It is ongoing, subtle, and deeply human, because desire does not wait for approval. It does not pause to ask whether it fits the story we tell about ourselves. It appears, insists, and lingers. And perhaps the most unsettling realization is not that we cannot control it, but that in some quiet way it has always been there, shaping us long before we ever noticed. You didn't just forget that name, that moment, that feeling. It didn't slip away. It was moved. Your mind erased it before you could even notice it hurt. We like to believe forgetting is passive, like dust settling. But what if it's active, protective, intentional? What if your mind is quietly hiding things from you, not to deceive you, but to keep you functioning? Here's the twist. What disappears doesn't actually go away. It waits. It reshapes itself. It comes back as habits, fears, choices you don't understand. So the question isn't what you forgot. It's what your mind decided you shouldn't remember. There is a peculiar moment when a thought almost surfaces, only to dissolve before it becomes clear. It hovers at the edge of awareness, familiar yet unreachable, like a word on the tip of the tongue. You feel its presence, but it refuses to fully appear. And often we dismiss this as a trivial lapse, fatigue, distraction, the ordinary limits of memory. But something doesn't add up. In the work of Sigmund Freud, this small, everyday experience is not accidental. It is a clue, a sign that the mind is not merely forgetting, but choosing, quietly, automatically, without consultation, to keep certain things out of reach. Repression, he suggested, is not a failure of memory, but a function of it. The mind, in its own hidden logic, protects itself by refusing entry to what it cannot comfortably hold. At first, this idea feels almost unsettling. It implies that we are not fully transparent to ourselves, that somewhere within us a process is constantly sorting, filtering, deciding what is allowed into consciousness and what must remain buried. Yet at the same time, it feels strangely familiar. Everyone has avoided a thought without quite realizing it. Everyone has felt a sudden shift in attention when something uncomfortable begins to emerge. But repression is not simply about avoidance. This is where things become difficult. What is repressed does not disappear. It lingers, active in absence. It reshapes behavior from beneath the surface, influencing reactions, preferences, even the stories we tell about who we are. A forgotten embarrassment might return as social anxiety. A buried loss might echo in an unexplained heaviness. The original memory is gone, or rather, inaccessible, but its effect remains. And so, the mind becomes layered. On the surface, a coherent narrative, intentions, decisions, explanations. Beneath it, something more fragmented, less orderly, but no less real. Freud saw this as a tension between what we can know and what we cannot bear to know, not because the truth is always dramatic or traumatic, but because it disrupts the fragile balance we rely on to move through the world. Yet this raises another question. If repression protects us, is it something to overcome or something to respect? Without it, every painful memory, every contradiction, every unresolved feeling might flood consciousness at once. The mind would lose its ability to prioritize, to soften, to continue. Repression, in this sense, is not simply a flaw. It is a condition of psychological survival. At the same time, its cost is subtle but persistent. When something is hidden, it cannot be integrated. It cannot be understood, only expressed indirectly. And so we live with patterns we cannot fully explain, drawn towards certain outcomes, avoiding others, guided by forces we do not quite recognize. We feel consistent, but beneath that consistency is a quiet instability. There are moments, though, when the boundary weakens, a dream that feels too vivid, a reaction that seems disproportionate, a sudden memory returning without invitation. These are not random. They are small openings, brief negotiations between what is hidden and what is allowed to be seen. And perhaps the most unsettling idea is this: the mind does not repress once and for all. It is an ongoing act, a continuous shaping of inner life, moment by moment, thought by thought. What you are aware of now is only a fraction of what has been filtered, softened, or pushed aside. So, the silence within the mind is not empty. It is structured, intentional, alive with what has been kept out of view. And if that is true, then understanding yourself is not just a matter of looking inward, but of wondering what exactly you have been prevented from seeing. Last night, you dreamed something that made no sense, faces melting, places shifting, logic breaking. You woke up and dismissed it. Just noise, right? But what if that chaos wasn't random at all? What if your mind was hiding something from you on purpose? Freud believed dreams are messages, but written in a language you don't consciously understand. And here's the uncomfortable part. Maybe your mind speaks most honestly when you're asleep, not awake. So the question isn't why your dreams are strange, but why they have to be. You wake with fragments, a hallway that led nowhere, a voice you almost recognized, a feeling that lingers longer than the images themselves. And almost immediately, the mind does what it does best. It explains it away, just a dream, nothing more. But something doesn't add up. Why would the mind, so efficient in waking life, produce something so disordered, so strangely specific, only to discard it? This is where Sigmund Freud begins his quiet disruption. He suggests that the dream is not meaningless at all, but a form of communication, only not in the language we expect. It is not direct. It does not announce itself clearly. Instead, it disguises, rearranges, and distorts. And this is precisely the point. Freud believed that beneath our conscious awareness lies a field of thoughts we cannot easily face, desires that contradict who we think we are, fears we have learned to suppress, impulses that would disturb the fragile order of our waking identity. The mind, then, does not silence these entirely. It transforms them. It lets them speak, but only through symbols. At the same time, the dream does not simply reveal, it conceals. It wraps its meaning in strange imagery, like a coded letter written in a language half forgotten. A falling sensation might not be about gravity at all. A familiar face might not represent the person it resembles. What we see is not the message, it is the mask. This is where things become difficult, because if dreams are symbolic, then interpretation is never straightforward. Freud called this process dream work, the way the mind reshapes hidden content into something less threatening. Condensation merges multiple ideas into one image. Displacement shifts emotional weight from one object to another. The result is a narrative that feels irrational but is carefully constructed. Yet, this raises another question. If the mind is disguising its own message, who is it hiding from? The answer is unsettling. It is hiding from you, the version of you that must function, that must remain coherent, that must believe it is in control. But in sleep, that control weakens, the barriers soften, and something begins to move beneath the surface. You might notice it not in the images, but in the feeling, a dream that leaves you anxious without clear cause, or one that feels strangely significant, even if you cannot explain why. This emotional residue is not accidental. It is the trace of something that almost revealed itself. Freud did not claim that every dream could be easily decoded. In fact, he warned against simple interpretations. The symbols are personal, shaped by individual experience. A house in one dream may mean safety. In another, it may suggest confinement. The language is universal in form, but deeply private in meaning. And yet, the idea lingers that somewhere within the chaos there is intention, that the mind is not merely producing noise, but attempting to speak in a way that bypasses resistance. It is tempting to dismiss this, to say that dreams are just neurological echoes, fragments of memory stitched together without purpose. And perhaps, in some sense, they are. But the persistence of certain dreams, the recurrence of certain images, the emotional intensity that refuses to fade, these suggest something more, not certainty, not clarity, but a direction. Because the dream does not tell you what to think, it invites you to look differently, to question why a certain image appears, why a certain feeling repeats, why something unresolved continues to surface in disguise. And maybe that is the quiet function of dreams, not to provide answers, but to disturb the illusion that everything within us is already known. You wake up, and the fragments begin to dissolve. But something remains. Not the images themselves, but the sense that they mattered. And perhaps they do, not because they are clear, but because they are not. You think your childhood is over, but it's not. It's just gone quiet. The way you react, the people you choose, the things that trigger you for no clear reason, none of it started yesterday. It started before you even knew how to explain yourself. That one moment you forgot, your mind didn't. That pattern you keep repeating, it's not random, it's familiar. But here's the uncomfortable part. What if you're not just living your life, but replaying it? There is a strange moment in adulthood when something small unsettles you more than it should. A tone of voice, a look, a brief silence in conversation, and suddenly your reaction feels disproportionate, almost foreign. You pause and wonder where it came from, but nothing in the present seems sufficient to explain it. And this is where things become difficult. Because if the present cannot account for the intensity of our feelings, then perhaps the answer lies elsewhere. Sigmund Freud insisted that it often does, not in the dramatic events we remember, but in the quiet, formative moments we don't. He suggested that childhood is not something we simply leave behind. It is something we carry, disguised, transformed, but active. Early experiences, even those that seemed insignificant, begin shaping the way we interpret the world. A child learns what love feels like, what safety means, what rejection does, but they don't learn it as theory. They learn it as sensation, as emotional truth. And those truths do not fade easily. At the same time, memory is unreliable. We do not recall most of our early years in any clear narrative form. Yet something remains, not as a story, but as a pattern. This is where Freud's idea becomes unsettling, because it suggests that what we cannot remember may still influence us more than what we can. Consider how often people find themselves repeating the same relational dynamics, drawn to similar personalities, entangled in familiar conflicts, reacting in ways that feel automatic. It is tempting to call this coincidence or habit, but something doesn't add up. The repetition is too precise, too consistent. Freud would argue that these are not accidents. They are echoes. The child, faced with experiences they cannot fully process, does not resolve them. Instead, they internalize them. These unresolved fragments remain active beneath awareness, shaping expectations and reactions. In adulthood, they reappear, not as memories, but as tendencies. This is where things become complicated, because if our present behavior is influenced by unresolved beginnings, then our sense of autonomy becomes less certain. Are we choosing freely, or are we reenacting something that was never fully understood? Yet, this raises another question. If these patterns originate in childhood, why do they persist even when they cause pain? Why repeat what hurts? Freud believed that the mind seeks resolution, even if it doesn't know how to achieve it. Repetition, in this sense, is not merely dysfunction. It is an attempt, an unconscious effort to return to the original conflict and finally make sense of it. But without awareness, the attempt fails. The pattern continues. And so, adulthood becomes layered. On the surface, it appears as a sequence of choices and events. But beneath it, there is another movement, quieter, more persistent, a return, a revisiting of something unfinished. This does not mean we are trapped, but it does suggest that understanding ourselves requires looking backward, not just forward. It requires noticing where our reactions feel older than our circumstances. And perhaps the most unsettling thought of all is this: the person you believe you have become may still be in conversation with the child you once were. Not visibly, not consciously, but constantly. You think anxiety just hits you out of nowhere, but it doesn't. It shows up in the middle of calm moments, quiet nights, simple decisions. And suddenly, your chest tightens. Why now? Because something inside you is arguing. One part of you wants comfort. Another demands change. One whispers, "Stay safe." Another insists, move forward. And you're stuck in between, feeling the tension but not the voices. What if anxiety isn't the problem, but the signal? What if it's the only way your mind can tell you something is unresolved? And if that's true, what exactly inside you is fighting right now? It often begins quietly, almost imperceptibly. A hesitation before speaking, a tightness in the chest without a clear cause, a subtle restlessness that refuses to settle. People call it anxiety, as if naming it were enough to contain it. But something doesn't add up. The feeling is too specific, too persistent, too strangely timed to be random. Freud once suggested that the mind is not a single voice, but a structure of competing forces. The ID presses forward with instinct and desire, indifferent to consequence. The superego watches from above, measuring, judging, imposing ideals that often feel impossible to reach. And between them stands the ego, trying to negotiate a fragile peace. Anxiety, in this view, is not an intruder. It is the sound of that negotiation breaking down. At the same time, it rarely feels like a negotiation. It feels like confusion. You want something, but you resist it. You avoid something, but you can't explain why. You feel pulled in two directions, yet neither is fully visible. This is where things become difficult, because the conflict does not announce itself clearly. It disguises itself as mood, as tension, as a vague sense that something is wrong. Imagine a moment of decision, to leave, to speak, to risk. Part of you moves toward it with urgency, almost excitement. Another part tightens, warning you of loss, rejection, or failure. Neither side is entirely wrong, yet they cannot coexist peacefully. And so the ego absorbs the pressure, translating it into anxiety, a signal that something within is unresolved. But anxiety is not merely a warning, it is also a form of communication. It tells you that the life you are living does not fully align with the forces within you. Yet this raises another question. What happens when you ignore it? Often the signal grows louder, not because the situation worsens, but because the conflict deepens. What was once a quiet tension becomes a persistent unease, and still it can be misunderstood. People try to eliminate anxiety without listening to it, as if silencing the alarm would extinguish the fire. Yet the discomfort remains meaningful. It points to a division that has not been acknowledged, perhaps a desire that has been suppressed, or a standard that has become too rigid. Freud did not see the mind as harmonious, and perhaps this is why anxiety feels so inevitable. It emerges not from weakness, but from contradiction. And so the question is not how to escape anxiety entirely, but how to interpret it. What is it trying to reveal? Which part of you is being ignored? Which voice has been given too much power? The answer rarely arrives all at once. It unfolds slowly, in moments of reflection, in fragments of realization. But even then, the tension does not disappear completely, because to be human is, in some sense, to remain divided. And perhaps anxiety is simply the feeling of that division becoming impossible to ignore. You don't feel trapped because you're weak. You feel trapped because you're civilized. Every day you edit yourself. You swallow words. You soften reactions. You become acceptable, and the world rewards you for it. But here's the tension. The more you fit in, the less of you remains untouched. We call it maturity. We call it progress. But something doesn't add up. Why does a stable life so often feel like a quiet suffocation? Freud had a disturbing answer, Maybe society works precisely because you don't. And if that's true, what part of you had to disappear just to belong? It begins in small, almost invisible moments. A thought that never becomes a sentence, a surge of anger that dissolves into politeness, a desire that is quietly postponed, then forgotten. You move through the day as if guided by an internal editor, one that has learned the rules so well it rarely needs to announce itself. And yet something lingers, a faint sense that beneath the calm surface there is pressure. Sigmund Freud believed this pressure was not accidental. It was the cost of civilization itself. He imagined early human life as something raw and uncontained, driven by instinct, by immediate need, by impulses that demanded expression. But such a life, left unchecked, could not sustain a stable society. If everyone acted freely on aggression, desire, and impulse, there would be no lasting order, only conflict. So something had to change. And that change did not happen in the world first. It happened inside the individual. Civilization, in Freud's view, is built on renunciation, not grand, heroic sacrifice, but constant, quiet restraint. You give up the right to act on every impulse in exchange for safety, structure, and belonging. This trade is so fundamental that it becomes invisible. You are taught it as a child, reinforced by reward and punishment, until eventually it feels like your own choice. But something doesn't add up, because even as society becomes more organized, more predictable, more secure, the individual does not necessarily become more content. In fact, Freud observed the opposite. Beneath the surface of modern life, its routines, its comforts, there is a persistent dissatisfaction, a restlessness that no amount of convenience seems to resolve. This is where things become difficult. The very system that protects you also restricts you. The same rules that make coexistence possible also limit expression. You are safer, but less free. And the tension between those two states does not disappear. It accumulates. Freud called this the source of our discontent, the conflict between instinct and order, between what you are driven to do and what you are allowed to do. At the same time, this restraint is not purely external. It becomes internalized. The voice that once belonged to authority, parents, society, culture, becomes your own inner voice. It watches, judges, corrects. It does not need to enforce rules loudly, because it has become part of your thinking itself. You begin to censor not because you are told to, but because it feels necessary. Yet, this raises another question. If civilization depends on suppression, then is discomfort not a flaw of the system, but its very foundation? Perhaps the unease you feel is not something to fix, but something to understand. A signal that the balance between order and instinct is never fully resolved. Freud did not offer a comforting conclusion. He did not suggest that we could simply return to a freer, instinct-driven life. That would collapse the very structure that sustains us. But neither did he pretend that civilization is purely beneficial. It is both protective and restrictive, stabilizing and suffocating. And so you remain in this quiet tension. You participate, you adapt, you restrain, you build a life that works even if it does not fully satisfy. You learn to live within limits, even as something in you resists them. Because the question never fully disappears. How much of yourself can you hold back before you no longer recognize what remains? You think you know who you are, But what if the version of you you trust most is the one doing the hiding? We spend years trying to understand ourselves, reading, reflecting, improving, yet something always slips through. Not because we're careless, but because part of us doesn't want to be found. Freud believed the mind isn't a mirror, it's a mask, and every time you look closer, it shifts. Here's the uncomfortable truth. Self-awareness isn't just discovery, it's confrontation. And the deeper you go, the less certain you feel. So the question isn't, who am I? It's, what am I still refusing to see? It often begins in quiet moments, not dramatic breakdowns or revelations, but small interruptions. When a reaction feels too strong, when a thought arrives uninvited, when something in you resists explanation. You pause, briefly, sensing that what you've always taken for granted as yourself might not be the full story. And yet, just as quickly, the feeling passes. You move on. Most of us do. But something doesn't add up. If self-knowledge were as simple as introspection, as reflection, as honest thinking, then why does it feel incomplete? Why do certain patterns repeat, even when we recognize them? Why do we act against our own intentions, as if guided by something just out of reach? This is where Freud's idea becomes difficult. He suggests that the mind is not fully accessible to itself, that beneath the surface of conscious thought lies a structure that does not reveal itself willingly. The unconscious is not hidden because we have failed to look. It is hidden because it resists being seen. And this changes everything, because it means that knowing yourself is not simply a matter of effort, but of resistance. There are parts of you that protect themselves from awareness, desires that disguise themselves, fears that redirect attention, memories that distort or dissolve. The mind, in this sense, is not transparent. It is strategic. At the same time, we continue to believe in our own clarity. We say, I know why I did that. We construct explanations, narratives that feel coherent, satisfying. But Freud would argue that these are often afterthoughts, stories built to cover something deeper. Not lies exactly, but not truths either, something in between. This is where the mirror metaphor begins to break. A mirror suggests reflection, accuracy, recognition, but the unconscious is not a mirror. It is more like a surface that bends, that fragments, that reveals only in distortion. And when you look into it, you are not guaranteed to see what you expect or what you want. Yet this raises another question. If the unconscious resists being known, is self-awareness even possible? Freud does not offer comfort here. He does not promise full clarity or complete understanding. Instead, he suggests something more unsettling, that self-awareness is partial, fragile, and often uncomfortable. To know yourself is not to arrive at a stable identity, but to encounter contradiction, to see not just who you believe you are, but what disrupts that belief. And this is where things become deeply human, because the resistance is not arbitrary, it is protective. What we avoid seeing is often what would unsettle us most. Not necessarily something dramatic, but something destabilizing. A desire that conflicts with our values. A fear that reshapes our decisions. A truth that complicates the story we tell about ourselves. So we circle around it. We sense it, but we don't name it. We approach, then retreat. And in doing so, we maintain a version of ourselves that feels coherent, even if it is incomplete. But occasionally, something breaks through. A moment of unexpected honesty, a recognition that feels sharper than usual, not comforting, but clarifying. And in that moment, the mirror does not reflect. It exposes. Yet even then, it does not stay. The mind closes around it again, reshaping, softening, reinterpreting. Because complete exposure is not sustainable. We are not built for total transparency. And maybe that is the final tension. That to know yourself is to accept that you will never fully know yourself. That clarity comes in fragments, and each fragment carries a cost. Not because truth is dangerous, but because it disrupts the balance we rely on. So the journey inward does not end with understanding. It ends with awareness of limits, with the recognition that the self is not a fixed object to be uncovered, but a shifting structure to be encountered. And perhaps the most honest reflection is not the one that shows everything clearly, but the one that reminds you how much remains unseen.